While you are reading these lines, the Kremlin is churning out 65 ballistic missiles every month. That is the maximum the state's war machine is capable of. And it is being funded with money that Russia essentially no longer has. Putin was directly warned about this by his own financial experts. Today, we will break down how much the Kremlin is actually pouring into the war. Why are the official figures lying? And where does the weaponry that strikes Ukrainian cities every day come from? Until 2022, Russia's military budget was relatively predictable, about 3 trillion rubles per year. That's roughly 10 to 11% of all government spending. After the start of the full-scale invasion, this figure began to grow every year. And since 2024, the Kremlin has stopped publishing real data on military expenditures altogether. Now, budget documents contain only plans, not actual results. In other words, a state that once at least somewhat reported to its own citizens now simply hides the numbers. And the explanation is quite simple, so as not to scare economists and not to show how much the war is eating the country from the inside. Moreover, since 2023, the detailed structure of Russia's budget expenditures has been classified by law, and the government has gained the right to transfer money between budget items without parliamentary approval simply by internal decision. Additional revenues can go directly into the president's personal reserve fund and be spent at his sole discretion without any oversight from the State Duma. In other words, the system that is formally called the state budget has in reality turned into the personal treasury of one individual with no accountability even to his own deputies. The deputy chief of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense, Major General Vadim Skibitsky, named the share of military expenditures in Russia's budget.
It is from the state budget that, as of today, the Russian Federation is waging war.
47%.
47% is
A terrifying figure.
it's a very large number.
For comparison, the Russian Ministry of Finance officially states a completely different figure, about 38% for defense and national security combined. The difference is almost 10 percentage points. This is precisely the portion that the Kremlin prefers not to show, even in its own documents. And here's something interesting. Officially, national defense in the 2026 budget has actually decreased slightly, from 13.5 trillion rubles in 2025 to 12.93 trillion in 2026. On paper, it looks as if the Kremlin is saving money on the war. But that's only what is shown in the reports. Because when Defense Minister Andrei Belousov himself let slip in December that defense spending amounts to 7.3% of GDP, the math revealed a completely different figure, about 15.86 trillion rubles. That's almost 3 trillion more than what is stated in the official budget. In other words, even in their own calculations, the Kremlin fudges the numbers and gets caught by its own officials.
Overall, they can produce 60 to 65 ballistic missiles for the Iskander system each month. And this is essentially the maximum they are capable of today.
Imagine a factory working at the limit of its capacity, 3 shifts without any days off. All the metal and all the country's resources are going in one direction. This isn't a reserve for the future. This is the maximum. And the Kremlin is throwing this maximum at civilian neighborhoods, hospitals, and the energy sector to sow panic in Ukrainian society.
Russia is very afraid of our deep strikes and middle strikes. They are in a panic over the possibility that we will use ballistic weapons. That's why, as they say, there's panic over there in the swamps.
In the first 4 to 5 months of 2026, Russia's budget deficit has already reached 2.5 to 2.6% of GDP. That's almost 6 trillion rubles. This has already exceeded the annual plan for all of 2026 by about 60%. According to Bloomberg, Russia plans to further increase military spending by another 4 to 5 trillion rubles on top of what is already allocated in the budget. To cover this gap, the Kremlin has already raised VAT from 20% to 22% starting January 1st, 2026, and sharply lowered the threshold for mandatory tax payments for small businesses from 60 million rubles in annual turnover to 10 million. Simply put, the state, which does not want to cut spending on missiles, has reached into the pockets of small business owners and ordinary consumers. The Ministry of Finance and the Central Bank of the Russian Federation privately warned Putin that military spending is leading the budget toward collapse and suggested cutting defense expenditures. The response was brief: find savings elsewhere. Defense is off limits. It's like a family where the father borrows money every month just to spend it again at the casino. And he forbids his family members from even talking about stopping. The money is running out, the debts are growing, and the gambler confidently says everything is under control. And now it's not just financiers who are criticizing this private casino club. Billionaire Oleg Deripaska, a Forbes-listed individual and not an opposition figure, publicly called the proposed budget project detached from reality, literally stating, "It's harmless to dream, even if you're just deceiving yourself." When such words come from an oligarch who has been part of the system his entire life, this is no longer outside criticism. This is a crack from within. Add to this the cost of servicing the national debt. In 2021, interest payments accounted for only 0.9% of GDP and ranked 8th among expenditure items. By 2026, this share is approaching 2% of GDP, nearly 9% of all federal spending. In other words, today the Kremlin is paying as much in interest on its debts as it once spent on entire sectors of the economy. This is not abstract economics for those who love charts. What this means is the following. The Russian war machine is already operating at the limits of its physical capabilities, both in terms of missile production and finances. It cannot endlessly increase its strikes, because every new wave of Iskanders is no longer the Kremlin's reserve strength, but a resource financed at the cost of panic within its own Ministry of Finance. It is important to understand this. When we hear another siren, the enemy is striking at the limit of their capabilities, not from a position of inexhaustible strength.